bit began by asking you if you'd like to stand up. I won't ask you if you'd like to leave. I confess, and this may sound unpopular given this gathering, but I confess that I love Europe. How could I not when Europe defines my identity? Or as we used to say in English, it has made me what I am. I don't mean the Europe of those EU panjandrums who have tried to procure for themselves everlasting remembrance by announcing beneath their pictures in London's EU headquarters the dates of the terms of their office as far ahead as next year. If they are tempting fate, then let fate answer them. Do you know Herman Van Rompuy and Jose Manuel Barroso how to make God laugh? Tell him your plans. But when I confess my love for Europe, I don't mean the labyrinthine corridors of bloodless bureaucracy, the Babel of regulations, and the engine room of a godless ideology. I mean Christian Europe. For Christianity, as we have heard twice this afternoon, created Europe. And traces of this divine benefaction remain in its buildings, its art, its literature, and its music. A cathedral in every city, a parish church in every village from Budapest to Galway Bay, from Seville to the Scandinavian fjords. The Europe of Giotto and Rembrandt, of Dante, of Shakespeare and Goethe, of Aquinas, Anselm, and Luther. Christian Europe, which gave us Gregorian plain chant, and so began the miraculous tradition of Western music. Bach, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, and other messengers of the audible sublime. There was a common currency, and it was Latin, the language of the church, of scholarship, and of the universities, which of course were Christian too. People forget, but Latin persisted long after the Reformation. Leibniz wrote in Latin in the 17th century. Christian monks, obedient to our Lord's command and to St. Paul's encouragement to us to exercise responsibility and hospitality to one another, founded hospitals, hospices, and schools. Christian merchants banded together in guilds and liveries to guarantee standards and honesty in their trades. Most of these guilds were dedicated to a particular saint, often the Virgin Mary. The guilds and livery companies were, and still are, I speak as chaplain sometimes to 6 of them, they're still dedicated to charitable giving. The more excitable elements in the church disdain civic religion, but there is such a thing as the civic soul, and it is still very much alive. I have seen this for myself as chaplain to city liveries and to the Lord Mayor and the sheriffs. The church is full for their services, their generosity to the wider community sincere and impressive. 400 soldiers in my church for the Remembrance Day service every year. Well, we have long since ceased the manufacture of rose-tinted spectacles. Europe was never heaven on earth. Frequently the nations went to war, and there were atrocities and terror. But it could have been a lot worse than it actually was. In this context, I'm reminded of the occasion when somebody said to Evelyn Waugh, "You know you're a proper shit, Evelyn." And he replied, "Yes, but think how much worse I'd be if I weren't a Christian." There were Christian armies, and there was a doctrine of the just war derived from Thomas Aquinas. There were Christian soldiers, such as Charles Martel, a patron of St. Boniface, who defended Christian Europe against barbarism. And there was barbarism to be overcome. As Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote in the 1820s, that erection of a temporal monarch under the pretense of a spiritual authority, which was not possible in Christendom, but by the extinction or entrancement of the spirit of Christianity, was effected in full by Muhammad to the establishment of the most extensive and complete despotism that ever warred against civilization and the interests of humanity. You'd be locked up if you said that today. We are not to imagine, though, that that barbarism is no longer a threat. Europe was a sinful place, half golden but also half rotten. But Christian Europe knew that it was steeped in sin. It knew also that Christianity is the remedy for sin. For if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Something began to go wrong at the time of what is misleadingly referred to as the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment. And what went wrong was philosophical theology. The God-centered thought of the Middle Ages was suddenly and shockingly replaced by the anthropocentric perspective. This contaminated the most distinguished thinking and the highest art. 2 examples. Descartes made the individual human being the starting point for all conjecture when he said, "I think, therefore I am." And nobody saw this was a vacuous tautology until Wittgenstein. In the greatest of all modern plays, Shakespeare has Hamlet replace the metaphysics of the divine being with a question: to be or not to be. Aquinas, to quote G.K. Chesterton, had announced, "There is an is." Hamlet says, "Is there?" And with the collapse of Christian philosophy comes necessarily the collapse of morality. For the same Hamlet who doubts God goes on with perfect consistency to say, there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. No wonder he becomes an indecisive, murderous neurotic who sees this goodly frame, the earth, only as a foul and pestilential congregation of vapors. And the decadence of the new philosophical theology happened in painting too. It was bound to, since human beings, following the example of their creator, perpetually seek to incarnate their thoughts in things. As T.E. Hume explained, you get the first hint of what went wrong in the beginnings of the Renaissance itself. In a person like Pico della Mirandola, for example, you get the hint of the idea that there is something which finally culminates in a doctrine which is the opposite of the doctrine of original sin. The belief that man as part of nature was, after all, satisfactory. The change which Copernicus is supposed to have brought about is the exact opposite of the fact. Before Copernicus, man was not the center of the world. After Copernicus, he was. You get a change from a certain profundity and intensity to that flat and insipid optimism which, passing through its first stage of decay in Rousseau, has finally culminated in the state of slush in which we now have the misfortune to live. When you get the collapse of philosophy involving the collapse of moral thought, what do you replace it with? Well, you replace it with the abstract doctrines of imagined universal rights, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And when you hear those words shouted in the streets, the next sound you will hear will be that of the tumbrils. In the interests of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the French revolutionaries set up what they called the Committee for Public Safety, which toured the country guillotining members of the public. And in place of Christian theology, the modern European Union's ideology is practical atheism. In place of Christian deontological ethics based on the commandments of God, the EU has become a relativistic, diverse, and utilitarian state, what Nietzsche called pig philosophy. As for the doctrine of human rights, it is a fraud, for every doctrine of rights is meaningless when the right has been emptied of its moral content. This is why libertarianism is not good enough. Utilitarianism is incoherent as a moral philosophy because it constantly defines good in terms of consequences without any clear notion of any objective good. And there is never any reckoning because particular consequences are always, for the utilitarian, in the future. Things are not done because they are the right things to do, but so that the pretended good always over the horizon, jam tomorrow. There is a resemblance between this view and the perpetually postponed climaxes in a Rossini overture. And music too showed signs of breaking free of its proper moorings and being employed as an instrument of progressive ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity in, say, the Eroica or in the last movement of that composer's Ninth Symphony. It was this suspicion which led even a lefty, such as Benjamin Britten, to remark the rot started with Beethoven. But notice this, the EU apparatchiks are relativistic, but only up to a point, for they hold their relativistic ideas with an intolerant absolutism. If I may put this epigrammatically, the guiding slogan of the EU is absolute relativism rules okay? Okay, except as we are finding it is not okay. For in the EU we discover a tolerance which tolerates only those who will submit to its diktats, present company accepted, like the bishops, and which will excoriate and outlaw any, however eminent, who depart from the new secular inquisition. To take just one example, and the man has been mentioned before this afternoon, Rocco Buttiglione was rejected as a candidate for the EU Commission because of his criticisms of homosexuality. He answered his rejection with the comment, "The new soft totalitarianism wants to have a state religion, but it is a nihilistic religion and a religion that is obligatory for all." They appointed Peter Mandelson instead. The totalitarianism of which Buttiglione speaks masquerades as democracy. That is, the leaders of the EU explain their unwillingness to incorporate Christianity in the emblems and insignia of the European project on the grounds that this would be undemocratic, since not all citizens of the community are Christians. But this is meager and misleading as a view of democracy, as simply the process of counting heads and doing what the majority wishes. For even a dyed-in-the-wool liberal like John Stuart Mill recognized that democracy is not about a head count, but about securing the liberties of minorities. In practice, of course, the EU does not extend the democratic principle to those who do not subscribe to its nostrums. Try to exercise your democratic freedom to question the validity of homosexual marriage or the equality of the sexes, what we must now refer to as genders, or to question the dogma of racism, and you will find that your vaunted democratic rights quickly disappear. In this way, the EU silences its dissenters by criminalizing dissent. As T.E. Hulme said, the wholesome medieval doctrine of original sin was replaced by the Enlightenment superstition of progress, and those things which were formerly occasions for shame turned into opportunities for celebration. You might say that what were once regarded as mortal sins are now lifestyle choices. So you can murder your unborn child if a pregnancy is inconvenient, and it is becoming progressively easier to have your grandmother put down if you covet her estate. So abortion is enshrined as a right, and euthanasia will not be far behind. But there are no rights in wrongs. Unfortunately, this is what you always get with humanistic ethics. Thus, opposition to the EU should not, for the Christian, be based on marginal interferences with what is tiresomely described as our freedom, though these are plentiful, but upon the fundamental discontinuity between our historic Christian understanding of ourselves and the new institutionalized secularism and atheism imposed and mediated by a godless and unaccountable bureaucracy. Too much of the criticism leveled at the EU is of the golly-gosh style of a Daily Mail shock horror editorial. Oh, you wouldn't believe what they've done now, you know. They've decreed we must eat only perfectly straight bananas. Whereas what is required is a fundamental philosophical demolition job on its essential principles, which are secular, atheistic, and nihilistic. If I may paraphrase Christopher Marlowe, why this is EU hell, nor are we out of it. Again, this notion of universal human rights on which the EU claims to base its politics and morality is a fiction. There are no such rights apart from rationalist conjecture. They are abstractions with no connection to what actually takes place. As Michael Oakeshott said, for the rationalist,
All that matters is that he has at last separated the ore of the ideal from the dross of the habit of behavior, and for us, the deplorable consequences of his success. Moral ideals are a sediment. They have significance only so long as they are suspended in a religious or social tradition, so long as they belong to religious and social life. The rationalist makes the arrangements of a society appear not as manners of behavior, but as pieces of machinery to be transported around the world indiscriminately. These are reasons any Christian might have for opposing the EU. Parochial and yokel as I am, I cannot for myself distinguish between being a Christian and being an Englishman, which means a member of the Church of England, but a serious member, in Richard Hooker's sense, every man of England a member of the Church of England. This was the genius of the Elizabethan settlement, with conditions laid upon us which are far from oppressive, to attend church 3 times in the year, of which Easter should be one, and to keep the peace. With the 1828 repeal of the Test and Corporation Act and the coming in 1829 of Catholic emancipation, this settlement provided a decent set of political liberties in this country which were envied and copied worldwide. I am not blind to the fact that there is a difficulty with the papacy, what C.H. Sisson describes as that international gang of opinion in Rome. For the Pope is, or had aspirations to be a prince as well as a bishop. I can sometimes bring myself to believe that the Pope is a Catholic in the sense set out in the Athanasian Creed. I can even believe that he is the anchor for the deposit of faith and the guardian of Christian truth. But this aspect of the Pope has to be distinguished from the political ambitions of the Holy See. As it says, not without reason, in our 39 articles, the Pope of Rome hath no jurisdiction in this realm of England. The EU is the modern form of the imperialistic, territorially ambitious Roman Catholic hegemony. Or if I may take my stand with Martin Luther, Henry VIII, and Nigel Farage, better off out. I am unable to subscribe to abstractions which are not rooted in locality. That is to say, I am an Anglican and an English patriot. Christianity for me can never be something universally defined and codified in a diagrammatic volume such as the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is merely religion as bureaucracy, doing what central office tells you to do. But Christianity is not a theory, a sort of religion by numbers, a glorified alpha course. Christianity is a way of life, and a way of life must mean a particular life in a particular place. Thus it is legitimate and lovely to speak of English Christianity, the church's year as parallel to the English countryside, and the difference between Dante, for all his miraculousness, and John Donne. Particularly the English prayer book expresses this character, and that is why it is despised and rejected by the globe-trotting pretensions of succeeding archbishops of Canterbury, and their greater interest in the phenomena of darkest Africa than in what is going on under their own nose. Localism and nationality are not incidental or mutually transferable. Where you are and how you understand yourself as part of where you are determines to a greater extent than we like to suppose who you are. I should think parallels between the opposition of Englishmen to Rome and their similarity to opposition to the EU are pretty obvious. The comparisons with international Protestantism are plain too. So let me say, in case you think me a mere sectarian, I'm no fan of Luther and Calvin either. We are assured by the new secularists that we can ditch our historic faith with all its outmoded doctrines, and yet all the good things about our society will stay in place. But 30 years before the reductionist, demythologizing theologians of the 1960s rejoiced that mankind had now come of age and had no use for traditional religion, T.S. Eliot correctly saw that the attempt to build a secular morality and to regard supernatural religion as something we have outgrown would lead to social collapse. He said, "Do you need to be told that even such modest attainments as you can boast in the way of polite society will hardly survive the faith to which they owe their significance?" It is the same point made recently by the philosopher Marcello Pera, former president of the Italian Senate. He says, "Christianity is so consubstantial with the West that any surrender on its part would have dramatic and catastrophic consequences. But will the church, the clergy, and the faithful be able to, and will they want to be purified of the relativism that has almost erased their identity and weakened their message and witness?" All this has been said before, and better, by, for instance, Joseph de Maistre, writing only 5 years after the 1793 reign of terror in France. He said, "Christianity is the religion of Europe. This soil suits it even better than the land of its birth. Here it has deeply rooted itself and is central to all our institutions. For all the nations of Europe and for all those that have taken the place of the Romans in this part of the world, Christianity is as ancient as civilization. The hand of this religion fashioned these new nations. The cross is on all the crowns. All the legal codes begin with the creed. The kings are anointed. The priests are judges. The priesthood is an order. The empire is sacred. The religion is civil. It follows that Europe must either be forever Christian or else it must be nothing." Eliot understood the profound disturbance in modern society which was coming about through the progressive disowning of its Christian roots, which disowning has become almost complete under the EU. Eliot said, "The whole of modern literature is corrupted by what I call secularism, that is simply unaware of, simply cannot understand the meaning of, the primacy of the supernatural over the natural life, of something which I assume to be our primary concern. Christianity has very definite rules about sexual conduct, but Professor Stephen Clark has given us the up-to-date, non-judgmental, non-discriminatory view of our contemporary secular religion and its watchword diversity. He says, unregulated hedonism easily concludes that any pleasurable contact of two skins is as good as any other. Radical amoralism judges that anything can be the object and occasion of a sexual desire. None is more natural than another. If you oppose that anything goes attitude, you will be regaled for some variety of phobia or sexism. And the secularists put it about that the doctrines of the Christian faith are simply not believable after the scientific revolution, but they are merely ignorant, for there is nothing in the whole of science which should make anyone doubt the creed. As Chesterton said, to say that a doctrine which was believed in the 12th century cannot be believed in the 20th is as if we should say that a doctrine we can believe on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday we cannot believe on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the EU is a theoretical project, despising our inherited and traditional manners and beliefs, an attempt, as it were, to start again from nothing at year zero, as Pol Pot did. But again, in the idea of a Christian society, Eliot warns, we are now told that the highest achievements of the past in art, in wisdom, in holiness, were but stages in development, which we can teach our youngsters to improve upon. We are told that we must not impose traditional culture upon the young, though we may impose upon them whatever political and social philosophy is in vogue. There is no doubt that in our headlong rush to educate everyone, we are lowering standards, destroying our ancient edifices to make ready the ground upon which the barbarian hordes will encamp in their mechanized caravans. The issues here involve the individual conscience, but they go far beyond it, finding their origin and meaning in what we may refer to as Christian civilization, the very soul of old Europe. Eliot again says this, An individual European may not even believe that the Christian faith is true, but what he says and makes and does will all spring out of this history of European culture and depend upon that culture for its meaning. Only a Christian culture could have produced a Nietzsche or a Voltaire. I do not believe that the culture of Europe could survive the complete disappearance of the Christian faith. And I am convinced of that, not merely because I am a Christian myself, but as a student of social biology. If Christianity goes, the whole of our culture goes. Then you must start painfully again, and you cannot put on a new culture ready-made. You must wait for the grass to grow, to feed the sheep, to give the wool out of which your new coat will be made. You must pass through many centuries of barbarism. We should not live to see the new culture, nor would our great-great-great-grandchildren. And if we did, not one of us would be happy in it. It might be asked, if Christian civilization is supposed to have been in the wrong all these centuries, on the basis of what is it proposed to put it right? Even recent unbelief has its roots in faith. Nietzsche could only say God is dead because Moses had first said God is alive. It is spiritual truth alone that can repair us. And this requires, as well as intelligence, it requires reflective contemplation on the whole history of what has made us what we are. And where better to begin in this than in church, but not as a blundering tourist. You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity, or carry report. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. And prayer is more than an order of words, the conscious occupation of the praying mind, or the sound of the voice praying. And what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you, being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living.
Thank you very much.